It's really a pleasure for me to introduce the Secretary of the Interior, Sally Jewell. Both my wife Roberta and I have known Sally for many, many years in the Seattle business community where we lived for a long time and where she lived before this sojourn in Washington, D.C., the other Washington. And she was always a very, very important member of the business community. I'm not going to go through all of the things on the resume because you can read that yourself, but what I wanted to point out was just a couple of things that would be resonating, I think, in a room like this. And the first thing is that she was a CEO. And to those of you in this room who are chief executive officers or corporate officers, it's not like she doesn't understand where you're coming from when you're facing business problems that have to do with the kinds of areas that are within her jurisdiction now, whether it's sustainability or use of public lands or any of these other things. She's been there. When she was at REI, she became CEO at a very critical moment of change in that company's history, and she handled the transition with enormous skill, enormous foresight, enormous creativity, and superb managerial talent. So we're very, very privileged to have, as a cabinet member of the United States government, her employer, somebody who really has had the kind of experience that those of you in this room have had and would appreciate. When she left REI for this new position, she left it in very good shape, economically, emotionally, lots of ways, in ways that any CEO in this room would recognize and be proud to have that as their testament and their record. When Secretary Jewell was Chief Executive Officer of REI, she kept quite a sharp eye on the bottom line and on how to run a business, and she ran it very thoughtfully and very well. But she also introduced early in her tenure there a whole program of not just sustainability, but stewardship, with sustainability being part of that. And this came at a time when, you weren't seeing a lot of it in American corporations. So she staked out a leadership position for the company that she ran to make these important, make this all an important part of her legacy there and part of what that company did. She defined stewardship, I just jotted down a few things, to include participation with grants and partnerships in the communities that REI served, so that the company was truly a player in its local markets and not just something that was disconnected to where it worked. It included sustainable operations, product sustainability, and employee engagement, meaning diversity, inclusion, fair pay and benefits, including for part-time as well as full-time employees. Sustainable operations became something that Secretary Jewell focused on extensively, looking for measurable ways to find out what kind of progress the company was making. And she worked on areas that are familiar to all of you, but were, fairly novel at the time, of really looking at greenhouse gas emissions, energy use, water and paper use, product sustainability, including supply chain sustainability, product materials, packaging, factory compliance. And all of these things were very, very important, and they had to be measured. And when she left the company, she left a legacy of tremendous success and growth in areas of stewardship. And what was particularly, I think, appealing and characteristic of her work in that area is that she distinguished herself not just by defining those efforts, but in inspiring others to get on board, to participate, and to make it part of their daily work experience, to always be thinking about stewardship as well as the other business drivers that we're all, so familiar with in running businesses. And she extended her reach not just from REI, but to become a leader in the outdoor industry outdoor recreation industry altogether, which ought to be a leader in many of these things. But she really pushed the entire agenda. What we're finding now, and we're very privileged to have Secretary Jewell with us today and to be in her position, but what she's brought to the Department of Interior is that same sort of leadership, charisma, intelligence, and creativity in going about her job that others might think of, as this massive government bureaucracy. She's started a number of initiatives within the department and outside the department. And maybe she'll mention one today a little bit, which is a new public-private partnership that she's begun to create opportunities for millions of kids, young adults, and post-9/11 veterans to participate on our public lands, to work on our public lands. And a lot of these partnerships are being put together with corporations, many of which are like the ones in this room. And it's a pretty imaginative way of going about and looking at a way to develop leadership for our public lands for the future, and today and for the future. So with that, it's really a wonderful opportunity for me to introduce the Secretary of the Interior, Sally Jewell, who probably the best Secretary of Interior ever.
Go for it.
Thanks, Chuck. Well, I will tell you the bar is very high on that last comment. There have been some really incredible Secretaries of the Interior and some memorable ones on the other side as well. And I walk by all their smiling faces daily as I go into my office, because it's really interesting to watch the evolution of facial hair and wardrobes since 1849, because they're all in the building. At any rate, it is a pleasure to be here. And thanks, Chuck, for that introduction. But I've got more thanks to give to Chuck than just that, because and I think the Woods Institute as well, because Chuck was involved very early here in the formation of the Woods Institute. We shared the position on the REI board before I went to work there. And then as I was promoted from COO to CEO in 2005, we schemed a bit about the differences that I could make in this role. And he put on my radar the importance of sustainability. And I suspect that many of you put on his radar the importance of sustainability through the Woods Institute. So if things come around full circle, I would say being here today at the invitation of Chuck has a lot to do with Chuck's leadership and your vision about the role that academia must play in changing the future course of our planet. So thank you, Chuck. Thank you, Woods Institute, for your incredible work. I'll also say that there are many in the room I've interacted with, Pam Matson and Peter Batusik and Steve Denning, Roberta Katz, all of whom have worked tirelessly in support of our national parks. And we've interacted through the National Parks Conservation Association and in support of the future of these treasures that are now under my stewardship, which is just a little intimidating. It's a lot easier to advocate for them than it is to actually make them work through shutdowns and other fun things. But I will say that for all of you that came, and it was enormously helpful, Buzz, to go around the room to know who's in here. I want to thank you for devoting your time to be here today, and for the kinds of interactions you'll have with each other, not just in the room today, but also through the connections you'll make. Because there's one thing that I learned at REI, it is that sustainability is a team sport. This is not something that anyone can do alone. You can't, as a business, make yourself completely sustainable without a utility industry that's trying to make itself sustainable, or without local municipalities that are working on things like recycling, or without nonprofit organizations that are raising awareness of things like the impact of not being able to trace your forest products supply to the destruction of the Brazilian rainforest. I mean, it takes a village, and it takes a village of a variety of different folks to really make this happen. But I will say that for it to really work, for us to change the course of our planet, which we've not charted a particularly sustainable course, as you're all aware, particularly in this room. If we're going to change the course of history, and if we are going to offset the impacts that we have had on this planet, the place it's really going to happen is with business. It is with the business community working hand in hand with scientists, with policymakers, with grassroots and grasstops people from throughout the communities to change the course of history. So I'm delighted that your session is today, because this week the President will be releasing the National Climate Assessment. And climate change will be all over the news this week. And I hope that you make hay while the sun shines. Of course, the sun's shining too much out here in California. You're all well aware of that. You got a little drought problem going on here. But I will say that your work together, your willingness to devote a few hours of your time to coming out this morning is an illustration of why this matters to you. What you're doing for the strength of your brands, for the foundations that you represent, for the people that rely on you to do the right thing, because it is the only thing that really will change the course of history. And that was very evident to me at REI. I'm just going to tell a couple little stories. I don't want to talk too long up here, because what I'd really like to get into is a dialogue with you, not just a Q&A session where you ask the questions and I'm supposed to be the grand oracle with the answers, but more an exchange of ideas, I hope, where you may have some ideas for me on what I could be doing differently to further this agenda, but also an exchange of ideas with each other, which of course is what you're going to be doing over the course of the day. I'm not going to be able to stay with you all day. I'm going to be heading up to Contra Costa County after this to talk to some wonderful city leaders and NGOs that are working on habitat conservation plans within their community to develop in a really smart way. Because casting a spotlight on what's happening around communities in this country for good is a big part of what my job can help do. But there was a woman running the San Diego store at REI early on in my tenure there as Chief Operating Officer. And she was giving me a hard time about catalogs that we were using. And she was actually a member of, or a donor to Forest Ethics. Well, Forest Ethics decided that they would make an example out of catalog retailers. And they really picked on Victoria's Secret that year. But they picked a little bit on REI and a bunch of others by rating us around Christmas time with everything from Santa Claus to caribous to fruitcakes to lumps of coal. And I remember that first year, I think it was actually maybe my first year as CEO, that REI rated like a fruitcake and 3 lumps of coal. It was not where I wanted to be, nor where the company wanted to be. With the support of a board of directors that was very enlightened, and I would say their enlightenment came largely through Chuck and his wisdom, gained probably through conversations with many of you. We started to really methodically go about in the organization what our impact was on the biosphere. 25 people, including this woman who was San Diego store manager, now manages the Seattle flagship store, Kara. People that were in a position to really do something about it, people that were the rabble-rousers and those most likely to hold us accountable, 25 in a room for 3 days, papering the walls on the company's impact on the biosphere, which is pretty intimidating. And I'm sure you run those kinds of exercises here at Stanford. And the trick is going from chaos down to focus. And we did. We focused on 5 areas, and Chuck referenced them. Understanding the carbon footprint from every facility, green buildings, I know that we've got architects in the room, paper and forest products usage, waste reduction and recycling, product stewardship itself all through the supply chain. And then you can begin to measure and chunk away at it. And it was had a profound impact on me, but I think all of our employees as they started to look at the world differently. And I've been, since I took the job in Interior, people kind of made fun of me. I mean, I'm always walking around with a water bottle, you know, try to not use any plastic water bottles, little things like that. I do have security in this job, but we're now driving around in a Ford Focus hybrid. So, you know, it's the only non-suburban generally in most of the entourages that come and go from the White House. But, you know, it's a statement. It's a statement that says if we're going to have to drive a vehicle, can we drive one that is less impactful on the planet? Can we give Ford some kudos for stepping out and doing more work around renewable energy? Can we bring visibility to these things that are making a difference? So I learned how complex sustainability is, but I also learned the importance of, as I mentioned, the NGO sector, but the government sector as well. So in the journey at REI, the company invested in solar energy on a number of stores. In fact, the first 100% solar store is down in Southern California in Orange County. First retail store that was 100% solar. And that's because REI not only had its own roof, but also used Best Buy's roof as well, thanks to the mall developer there. California had incentives for companies to bring solar energy. California has renewable energy standards, where I think it's 33%, I don't know if it's 2020, but is it 2020? And that creates a market for the utilities, and there's several PG&Es in the room, I know, where they then have a motivation to invest in these facilities. And that is really important. If states did not have incentives, or there wasn't utility scale solar, wind, geothermal, or other renewables, a company like REI would have a very difficult time finding sources of energy to green the footprint. So government plays a role. State government plays a role. Local government can play a role. In the REI journey, trying to deal with very real anxiety on the part of employees that they were putting an awful lot of plastic into waste bins. The company took it all the way up the supply chain to work on a consistent use of a single type of plastic in poly bags that could be recycled, so that the individual guilt that employees felt in dumping things in a dumpster could be met by not having to put them in the dumpster, but putting them in a recycling bin, or better yet, coming up with packaging that could be reused, which they did with bicycles and so on. So there's a lot of innovation that comes from creating an environment where people are asked to do the best thing that they can around sustainability, and to unlocking that, while also working with government, NGOs, and others that can help you in that journey. So let me shift a little bit to the Department of Interior. I will presume that everybody doesn't know the portfolio, so let me just give you a quick rundown. It's certainly national parks, as I mentioned, but basically over 500 million acres of federal public land. The only other large federal landowner that's not an interior would be the U.S. Forest Service, which is in the Department of Agriculture, because forests were considered crops largely. So that's why the Forest Service is in ag. The Bureau of Land Management, the National Park Service, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service would be the large land management organizations. So 500 million acres of surface land, 700 million acres of mineral estate, because the Bureau of Land Management also oversees the mineral estate for other public lands, including the Forest Service. We've also got 1.7 billion acres of the Outer Continental Shelf. So oil and gas development, wind energy development, wave development, if it's outside the 3-mile state limit, is part of the Department of Interior. One of the things that I like to do a lot is wear jewelry indicative of the indigenous people of this country, which I'm doing again today. That is also a very important part of our portfolio. We uphold trust and treaty obligations to the 566 federally recognized American Indian tribes and Alaska Natives. And I see in your timeline, a 10-year timeline, a focus on indigenous people of this country, and I applaud the Woods Institute for doing that. The first people in this country understood how to actually live sustainably in our environment, something that we have changed up as we have expanded and settled and grown and developed. We still have much to learn, and fortunately there are some, the older generation of many of our Native people have a lot of traditional ecological knowledge that can be very, very helpful to us. So I appreciate the focus of the Woods Institute in that arena. I will also say that our nation's first people are really on the firing line when it comes to climate change. Alaska Native villages that I visited that have been pummeled by pack ice that has moved out a lot quicker than in earlier years, that is actually causing a rapid acceleration of coastal erosion. We see invasive species like cheatgrass invading a lot of the prairie lands in Utah and Nevada, causing a very devastating wildfire cycle that is impacting Indian country more than other areas. And I noticed this morning that there's a new fire on the San Carlos Apache Reservation, which I'm actually going to visit in a couple of days, that has been 0% contained at this point in time. Cultural practices, species that they rely on, from golden eagles to salmon, are being impacted by climate change and habitat degradation. And it's part of all of our jobs to change up the way we live in this planet, with much to learn from our indigenous people. So as I've gone about this new job, which is, you know, I could lie about it, but it's just really, really big. The U.S. Geological Survey is part of the Department of Interior, big operation here in Menlo Park. incredible scientists and researchers that are doing some really good stuff. The Office of Surface Mining, Reclamation and Enforcement is another part of Interior. The Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, the Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement. There are many pieces and parts of this puzzle, but there are three things that are impacting us across the entire network of government, and particularly in Interior. They are that we're operating in a time of constrained resources. Very, very difficult to make the kinds of investments that you expect us to make when you're operating. My first year, 2013, sequestration, followed by that lovely government shutdown. A complete and utter waste of taxpayer resources, a complete and utter frustration. And I know there's a lot of scientists in the room. Can you imagine you've been keeping continuous data for your entire career, which has been keeping continuous data on prior scientists who've been monitoring the same species, the same climate information straight for 100 years. Ouch. And you're told by law that you cannot check your, do your science for basically 3 weeks in October. If you're dealing with a bird migration pattern that's coming through that same area, you cannot count the birds by law, or the caribou migration, or the water monitoring on Mount Rainier National Park that has been happening continuously for 116 years. Now, modern technology, the computers can keep working, but that technology, because it's 116 years old for consistent data, has to be done by hand in exactly the same way that it was being done 116 years ago. That's the nuttiness of 2013 and the dysfunction we face in Congress. So I will say that you should be outraged by that. I certainly was. You know, the obvious stuff, closure of the national parks, you know, people's vacations disrupted, all of that's really bad, but there's all this kind of behind the scenes stuff that is so, so important. But we're operating at a time of constrained resources. We're operating at a time when beating up federal employees is sport on the part of many. And I have to say that I think one of my biggest jobs is to be a champion and a cheerleader for federal government employees that do incredible work every day that we all rely on. We just don't know it. I will also say the federal government does a lousy job of marketing. Yes, that's for all the federal employees out there. You know, I didn't hear Google around here, but I like to say I just wish Google, when you look up Google Earth, would give credit to the USGS and Landsat 8, which is providing that data. Or maybe the Weather Channel. People are saying, why do we need the National Weather Service when we have the Weather Channel? Well, where do you think the data comes from? So you think I'm kidding, but I'm not kidding. There are members of Congress that ask this question all the time. At any rate, we're operating in a time of constrained resources. As Chuck mentioned, we're also operating in a time of a massive generational transformation in this country. Chuck and I represent the baby boom, and there are a handful of you in the room that resemble us in that generation. We're 76 million strong. In between us and our children is Gen X, which is only 49 million, relatively few people, a number of those represented in the room. And then you've got the millennial generation, 79 million strong, those born between 1980 and 1995. Fully 1/3 of all Department of Interior people are eligible to retire now or within 5 years from now. The people that I would be bringing in to learn at their knee have been impacted by constrained resources, and that's a huge issue, and it's one of the reasons I will talk a little bit later about our youth initiative. But we got a massive generational transformation going on. You at Stanford understand, and actually in all the businesses that spoke up, that this new generation cares a lot about the planet. They care a lot about making a difference. They do not want to perpetuate the mistakes that their parents and earlier generations have made. So we need to give them a platform to do that. And that's something I've asked my colleagues in Interior to think about every single day in everything they do, particularly reaching into communities of people that have had very little exposure to nature and the outdoors, to give them that exposure so that they can have these kinds of jobs on their radar for the future. The third main challenge, not challenge, but trend that we face, it is a challenge, and that is climate change. And that's mainly why we're here to talk about today. And I have asked my colleagues in Interior to think about it in every single thing that we do. And they do. So we feel it right now in California in drought. This is, I don't know how many visits I've made to California, probably close to a half a dozen. Lots of challenges going on here. And you drive around and it's pretty green and it's pretty lush. And I know it's springtime. Reservoirs are full of water. It doesn't feel like there's a problem. There is a big dog problem here. The Bureau of Reclamation, also part of Interior, manages the Central Valley Project, works in concert with the State Water Project, balancing the interests of environmental flows and salination levels in the Bay Delta relative to all of the agricultural interests, generally south of the Bay, some north of the Bay, that rely on this water. It's a huge challenge in the West, and that is not going to get easier with climate change, and I know that many of you are acutely aware of that. We see it in wildfire risk. So tomorrow I'll be down in San Diego with CAL FIRE, bringing visibility to the impact of wildfires, and we're expecting a really tough season here in California as we release the fire predictions. We see it in wildlife. I mentioned some of the species that are so important to the indigenous people of this country, like salmon and certain bird species. But we see it in critters that are critical to the ecosystem, usually with really funny names that members of Congress like to make fun of, that are also indicator species of the health of our ecosystems that we've got to work with. So it is, it's everywhere we look. But I will also say there's reason for hope. The Corps of Engineers and the Bureau of Reclamation now working far more closely with the Fish and Wildlife Service on learning from the lessons of Mother Nature on green ecosystems, on resilient infrastructure. And I think Buzz mentioned some of that in his opening remarks about what the Woods Institute is looking at. It's mangrove swamps, it's dunes, it is wetlands, and things that we have seen through the USGS work that protect communities and infrastructure from the threats of climate change, like Hurricane Sandy or like Hurricanes Katrina and Rita. We're also learning when we do something really bad, like the very unfortunate oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, that as investments and restitution is made for that spill, that we can build back ecosystems that are much more resilient than those we left behind. So the president released his climate action plan in June. That was enormously helpful. You will hear him as he talks about the current national climate assessment say, we're done arguing. This is real, it's man-made, we need to move forward, we need to do everything we can from a business standpoint, individual, NGO, government, to make a big difference. And that will be coming out in a few days. So what are our roles? And I hope that you embrace them as warmly as I do, because one of the reasons I took this job had to do with climate change, had to do with going beyond running a business that was focused on sustainability to actually being able to do something about it. And I think if we all take our jobs with that kind of area of focus, we actually will do something about it, especially here, because you have the opportunity and the brain power in this room and at this university and in your companies to make it happen. First, we have to have aligned science, and that's one set of the facts. The International Panel on Climate Change, and I know there are people in the room here that are part of that effort, is an international effort to bring one set of facts to the table that people can operate on, enormously helpful. The universities bring incredible research and knowledge and a path forward to help all of us, businesses and otherwise, figure out where we go. You also engage students, and students push and pull you, and that's really good. And I think creating an environment where they can be, they can push on you is really critical. NGOs I talked about, not only kind of holding businesses accountable, but also companies or organizations like the Nature Conservancy or the Trust for Public Land, critical infrastructure, critical habitat that they're locking down to get into public ownership or into permanent conservation. They raise awareness about all of these things. They hold us accountable. They rally support from grassroots as well as grass tops, and that I can't say how critical that is. Business, you've got a role to play in running sustainable businesses. I mean, business must be sustainable to operate, and if we have a planet with an ecosystem that's collapsing, everybody's going to lose. So, but I think that your creativity in creating a market for sustainable paper, in creating a market for green power, is going to help the PG&Es and the other utilities across the country do the right thing. And if you work together, you can get the most powerful engine of the world working in concert with climate change, and that is the economic engine. Government plays a major role. We can make it in your economic best interest to do that through regulation. We have both carrots and sticks. I like the carrot approach more than the stick approach, but both work. And the President's Climate Action Plan did a number of those things. The EPA regulations around power plants CAFE standards for the emissions from vehicles. I don't think there were any vehicle companies in the audience here, but oh, General Motors is here. Okay, great. So when there is a standard out there, companies, I don't know that this table got fully introduced because my colleague David J. Did you get introduced? Okay, I just know you so well, I wasn't tuned in. The car companies rise to that challenge. When there is a goal there, they rise to that challenge. And the same thing can be said for a number of other of the opportunities we have to put a goal out there that people will achieve. And they've done it over and over and over again. So government plays a very, very important role in doing that. And I will say that at Interior, we have a lot of land. We stood up 13 gigawatts of permits for renewable energy projects on federal land. They haven't all been built because we need power purchase agreements. So for all the utilities out there, we'd love your support in doing that. But it's helped by California's renewable energy standards, Nevada's renewable energy standards. We're working cooperatively with land managers to say what are the areas of high development potential from a scientific basis, what are the areas that are too special to develop for a variety of reasons, and how do we put that together with technology so everyone knows what's accessible to them. We're doing that through the Desert Renewable Energy Conservation Plan here in California, and I'll be out meeting with tribal stakeholders to talk to them about that whole plan later on this week. So I just want to conclude here with what I will call the ultimate act of sustainability, and that is educating and engaging the next generation of young people in this work. There are fewer faces from the millennial generation in this audience than are represented in the population. I know out there in the Stanford campus, there's lots of them, but we must engage the next generation. And there are many kids, most kids, they're more urban than ever before. They're more disconnected from nature than ever before for all kinds of reasons I'd be delighted to go into. But they really do care about the planet, and we need to show them a path forward. So as I was joking with Chuck, one of the duties I didn't expect to take on in this job was fundraising, but I am, because we need help from the private sector to get more young people engaged in playing in the outdoors, in learning, in the best classroom there is, which is the one with no walls, in serving, doing volunteer service on public lands, because when you get out and volunteer, you never look at that space in the same way, and in working on public lands. So we're actually, David J.O., my colleague over there, wave David. David's going to be taking notes on all the smart things you say all day so he can give them back to me. David is the only person that I brought with me from REI, and he was the grant maker at REI. Our job collectively is to work with businesses to say, will you be partners with us in this effort? So I want to thank the GAP for hosting us later on today with a group of folks, some in the room here, who we're going to talk to about that effort. But if we want a sustainable future, we have to have an electorate that cares. We have to have an electorate that's seen what's happening on the ground and understands what's happening in nature so that they can be part of the solution. So that is, I consider the ultimate act of sustainability, and something that I hope you'll all think about in terms of your own children, your grandchildren, your communities, in really making sure that we give young people visibility into our environment and what's at stake. So I just want to end by saying sustainability is a team sport. We're all in this together. You have a key role to play, whether you're business leaders or academic leaders, and we can't look at this as a trade-off between development and conservation. The definition of sustainability is that we have to find a way to have both, and I'm confident that we can. So we look forward to partnering with you on those initiatives, and at this point, we've got about a half an hour, I think, to take some questions. So I'll wrap it up at that. Thank you very much. Questions are really smart ideas.
Secretary Jewell, Jim Hanna with Starbucks. Good to see you again.
Nice to see you again, too. Starbucks hosted us at a
Yeah, and I just want to give some feedback from our CEO, Howard Schultz. He admires your courage for taking on the government and appreciates that. So pass that on to you.
Thank
My
you.
question, though, is I was at an investor conference last week in Boston, and what we're hearing from the NGOs, from the investors out there, from government officials and others, is that the definition of sustainable leaders in business is now moving beyond those who simply get their own house in order to those that are more directly engaged in policy conversations. And frankly, I think that frightens a lot of businesses to be really advocates for climate policy, advocates for sustainable business practices, advocates for regulating ourselves. Can you talk about that a bit? Because I know that the chair of the Council for Environmental Quality also spoke at that event, and he said, please, business community, come out there and support the president's new rule, the EPA's new rule on carbon emissions from power plants, but also just show up on Capitol Hill and get your government affairs folks to be very active in climate policy. But there's a general fear out there, I think, in the business community to do that. Can you comment on that?
I'd be delighted to comment. Does this mic work when I'm not standing in front of the big mic? Okay. During my 8 years as CEO of REI, my understanding of the importance of engaging in the political process grew from basically nothing to recognizing that our voice as business people is critically important. So REI, just to use that as an example, is in the business of facilitating people's enjoyment of active outdoor recreation. We need public lands in that business to have a business. And if the public lands are dangerous because they aren't well enough managed and they're turned over, and you've got these issues in California with drug activity, for example, trafficking and growing and other things on public lands, they become unsafe and people will turn to other kinds of activities. The outdoor industry used to call on Capitol Hill and talk about the importance of conservation. And I think a lot of people thought, oh, here come the greenies. During that period of time, and this was actually an effort led by Mike Collins, my colleague at REI, he said, we've got to stop talking about the green of conservation and start talking about the green of money. So REI paid for a study under the auspices of the Outdoor Industry Association that quantified the economic value of outdoor recreation. They've come up with 2 studies. The most recent one was released in 2012 based on 2011 data, and it said active outdoor recreation is a $646 billion industry that supports 6.1 million jobs. That speaks volumes. That really turned the whole discussion away from conservation to economic health of rural communities, sustainable use of our landscapes, recognizing the value of things like national parks and BLM lands and Forest Service lands and campgrounds and multiple use, recognizing that hunting and fishing are important opportunities for people to engage in the outdoors in ways that their ancestors have done, but they're losing track of. And that really changed the dialogue. And when I used to call on Capitol Hill with an arch rival, EMS, from the Northeast, CEOs of both companies went and called together. And that was shocking to people. But I used to say my competitors aren't EMS. Competitors really Best Buy. It is sedentary activities, things that keep people indoors. And if we make the outdoors inaccessible or unsafe or otherwise, we're going to lose that business. And that argument really worked. So that's just an example of saying that I wouldn't be in this job if I hadn't been doing that. And the ability to be in this job now, I see the influence that businesses have on elected officials, for good or for not so good. Your voices are really important. I've mentioned some of the incentives that REI took advantage of when it invested in solar power on the stores. Couldn't have made it work economically, even over a 10-year period of time, and it was an anemic return on that, but still, it moved the organization forward, and it was something that our customers were proud of. Customers, in REI's case, also shareholders, because it's co-op. So your voice is really important. I think that, as I talk to oil companies, and I talk to oil companies a lot because we've got the Outer Continental Shelf. We're the regulator, we're the permitter, but also onshore oil and gas activities. There isn't one oil company that I have talked to, and I know Chevron's represented here, that isn't already planning in a cost of carbon in their long-term plans. We are not paying the true cost of our extractive industries broadly, and I think that's something that we need to look at. Business voice would be very, very helpful at the table on that. And it's quite interesting. Individual businesses work very closely with us. In fact, a couple of examples, Noble, Anadarko, one other I can't recall, working with us and the state of Colorado on methane emission standards. Those things are enormously helpful. But we will hear from the trade associations, well, they don't represent all of us. So it's difficult. And I just say, stand up for what you believe in. Starbucks, great illustration of a company that was very, very early to the table on sustainability of farming and looking at all the middlemen that were involved in, the human rights situation in the supply chain, and did something about it and then told everybody about that, which inspired others to do the same. I think that that's extraordinarily important. So it's probably going to be easier for you to go out and lobby for carrots as opposed to sticks. I understand that. But I would also say that giving a message to your suppliers, vehicles, for example, that increasing mileage is very important to your bottom line, those kinds of things. Business leaders are helping themselves while also helping the planet, and that is sustainable in and of itself. But your voices on Capitol Hill are really important. And I guarantee you, one of the challenges of the outdoor industry, like I say, it's 100 mile wide and a quarter of an inch deep, and that goes for political contributions as well. Very, very little influence on the money side on Capitol Hill, as opposed to some industries that are very concentrated and very wealthy and can have much bigger political influence. So where you can bring influence is in actually being there, talking about the issues, and they will welcome you to their offices if you're constituents of theirs. And I can't say how important I think that is.
You talked about walking down the hall and seeing the pictures of all of your predecessors. Are there one or two of them that just jump out in your mind for having done just dramatic, bold things, and or maybe your counterparts in France or China?
Yes, I'd say that Harold Ickes, who is, he was the head of the Department of the Interior under Roosevelt, FDR. He did some pretty incredible things. He was really a champion of human rights in many ways. Just a little example. You got these little points of leverage you don't know when you take this job. So one of his points of leverage was that the stadium that the Washington Redskins played in was actually managed by the National Park Service. And they were not an integrated team. They wouldn't let blacks play. And he said, "You don't let blacks play, I'm not renewing your lease." Now that's courage. He's the guy that when Marian Anderson, the opera singer, was turned away from Constitution Hall by the Daughters of the American Revolution from doing a concert because she was black, he said, "How about the Lincoln Memorial?" 75,000 people came to that concert. So Harold Ickes was a visionary, an amazing leader, and his picture is always greeting me because he actually built the building that I sit in, which is, it's really a fortress. It was a WPA project, but as part of the WPA work, the whole Civilian Conservation Corps, Harold Ickes played a major role in that. FDR, of course, did. And I'll tell you a quick story about the CCC. 1933, the president and Ickes, scheming with him, conceived of the Civilian Conservation Corps, introduced legislation to Congress on the 21st of March, 1933. It was passed on the 31st of March. The first Conservation Corps person was hired on the 7th of April. The first camp was set up in a national forest, George Washington National Forest in Virginia, on the 15th of April, 1933. By July, mid-July 1933, or 1st of July 1933, they had 1,400 and some camps set up with 500,000 individuals, including 25,000 Native Americans and veterans working in the camps. That is extraordinary. And I'm scratching and clawing to raise money from the private sector to bring back the 21st century version of the conservation, of the Civilian Conservation Corps, what I like to call CCC 2.0. But it's a little tougher than it was in those days. But Harold Ickes did some amazing things. I'd also say Stuart Udall, who was, who did Stuart serve under? Was it Carter? Kennedy. That's right, it's Kennedy, I think that's right. Did some really pretty incredible things in terms of looking at ecosystems and setting land aside and really managing our land in a much more sustainable and thoughtful way. So those are a couple of names. There's some notables on the other side that I won't comment on, but those of you that have been around a while will know their names.
Secretary Jewell, has a former federal government employee, almost 30 years, I want to thank you for your support for the federal government employees. They really deserve it. And I think about my former colleagues a lot. I wanted to say, in the insurance industry, the price signal is very important. And I noticed, reading the papers, that we have an issue, I think, with Bureau of Land Management and some who are using that resource and not wanting to pay for it.
Yeah, we don't think that's okay. Yeah, actually, the Bureau of Land Management is an interesting agency. It operates under an act called FLPMA, F-L-P-M-A, which stands for something that I won't try and remember, Federal Lands Policy Management Act or something like that. And it talks about multiple use and sustained yield. So the multiple use, which is what most people think about, says, doesn't have the high level of restrictions on it that, say, a national park would. That would be kind of the highest levels of protection, or wilderness areas within a national park would be the highest level of protection. BLM is open to a lot of different uses, including oil and gas extractive activities, mining, grazing, and other activities. So yes, we've had a little incident in Nevada recently where a rancher was grazing his cattle for 20 years without paying grazing fees. And we've gone through every means of legal pursuit to have him remove his cattle. And they're grazing in areas that are really sensitive habitat where you've got low carrying capacity for animals and a lot of damage that's being done to ecosystems. And so we've asked him to remove his cattle and he doesn't. So we went to actually impound the cattle and were met by hundreds of armed militia members. It's not okay. We was one of the two all-nighters that I've pulled in this job. One was around the government shutdown and reopening national parks using state funds, and the other was the Clive and Bundy standoff situation. And basically, Neil Cornsey at the Bureau of Land Management, my chief of staff, and I said, no drop of human blood should be spilled over this. So we backed down our folks. The ability of people to use social media and other means to call out militias that are highly armed, that actually had automatic weapons aimed at federal government employees, is just wrong. So we're working with our colleagues in the Justice Department to bring these folks to justice, and we certainly will pursue that. But the BLM has 270 law enforcement people in total patrolling roughly 270 million acres of land. It's 1 million acres apiece. And of course, they're doing really, really important service. Dan Love, who runs BLM law enforcement in Utah, busted 3 rings of gravediggers that have been digging up and selling artifacts, largely from the Four Corners region of the Southwest, for their personal gain for 15 years. He brought them all to justice, all on misdemeanor charges, no jail time. But all the artifacts are now in the process of being repatriated to tribes. That's the work of the BLM. So to be put in a situation where you're having an armed confrontation because somebody doesn't believe in the federal government is wrong. Fortunately, with a microphone, Mr. Bundy's taking care of himself. I don't know if any of you watched the White House Correspondents' Dinner the other night, but the president quoted him and one of his lines that was very racist. And I think that's helped turn the tides. But I will tell you that there was a period of time when federal government was being vilified for upholding the law. And these white-hatted ranchers were being celebrated for standing up to the federal government. I mean, it's just outrageous, and we just can't have that. So thank goodness the tides turned. But nobody's paid enough in any service to be taking that kind of abuse, and certainly not BLM law enforcement service. So we stand with those guys and appreciate your support of federal folks.
Secretary Jewell, thank you for being here this morning, and I really appreciate the good work that you're doing for our country. Excuse me, I'm recovering from a cold. But working for Chevron, I often admire companies and have this secret envy of companies like Starbucks and Gap that, they have, they're consumer-facing companies. They have a different product stewardship. They can really do admirable things in their supply chain and bringing up farm workers within different countries to increase their quality of life, and they sell beautiful clothes that people want to buy. But I do see a difference between those companies that are that focus on sustainability in terms of their product stewardship. And while they have impacts, such as water and land and agriculture, they are different than the impacts that a company like Chevron and other extractive companies create. So I'm wondering if you see that difference too, and if we can, what is the way that we can stop kind of comparing apples to oranges and say we're all in it, even though we all impact differently, we're all in it together, but nevertheless, there's a special stewardship that extractive companies take on, and if so, can you talk a little bit about, in your discussions with oil and gas companies, what do you see that special stewardship being?
Thanks for the question and for having the courage to stand up and pose it. I came originally from the oil and gas industry. I worked for Mobil Oil as a petroleum engineer, and I'm probably one of the few, maybe the only Secretary of Interior that's fracked wells before. So I have an understanding. Steve and I were talking a little bit before. It's useful to have that kind of a background because you can't get snowed, but you can also help dispel some of the fear and the risk that goes around with misinformation as well. I would say this, that we cannot do our jobs in terms of addressing climate change without the extractive industries as important partners. I do think that the influence that you have with your trade associations is really important. It is a little bit frustrating when individual companies, and I called out Anadarko, for example, or Noble in the discussion around methane, step out and are really helpful, but the larger trade associations say, they don't necessarily speak for all of us. I think that larger oil companies have a responsibility to speak up and say, methane capture is important. There are ways we can reduce our carbon footprint through fossil fuel usage. When it comes to development of an oil and gas play like the Bakken, and I don't know that Chevron's necessarily a big player in the Bakken, but for those who are, the oil is very lucrative, and the natural gas is being flared at best or vented at worst because there isn't a natural gas collection system up there yet. I mean, they're working hard on the infrastructure, but it would be very helpful for industry to say, we will invest in the infrastructure necessary to reduce the methane emissions before we will produce the oil. We recognize that there are environmental consequences, even if there may not be carrots or sticks yet in the regulatory process that promote that. And there are oil companies that I would say are more leaders in that way. So, I mean, I would encourage that kind of leadership and also pulling your organizations along. I'll also say that in general, when you're working with a large oil company, which has a lot of resources and sophistication, like Chevron, it's easier sometimes to have these conversations. But a lot of the challenges come when the larger oil companies move on to new plays and smaller companies come over to take on existing plays, and they don't have the capacity or the wherewithal to necessarily manage those in as environmentally sensitive way as the larger companies did. And that's an issue for the whole industry. If you have oil and gas activities going on and you have a bad actor as a contractor or a smaller player, and for example, flowback fluids get dumped where they're not supposed to get dumped, and those kinds of things do happen, the whole industry suffers. And I think that the industry, we're all dependent on fossil fuels, every one of us. We're probably sitting under lights that are powered by fossil fuels. I burned fossil fuels getting here this morning and certainly flew in the air, putting lots of carbon into the atmosphere between Washington, D.C. and here yesterday. But there are ways that we can do that that are less impactful and more sustainable than what we do. And I think large companies could take a more offensive posture as opposed to defensive posture in doing that. And I think there are some examples of that. So, those are a few illustrations, but it sure would be nice if we didn't feel we were working at odds with the industry or with the trade associations, that we were working in concert as we do when we work with individual companies. So those are a few thoughts. But also, love you to be investing in some of these technologies that move us beyond a carbon-dependent economy. And I think there are a lot of companies that have done that very effectively as well.
Secretary Jewell, thanks. Andrew with Multi-Sustainability Partners, and we advise some energy investors on environmental social impacts. I appreciate your perspective on the fracking and some of these issues to compromise on. I want to go back to a comment you made about the sort of younger generation, the youth, and getting them to see government not as this caricature that's portrayed as on, on the networks typically, and people who work in federal government as bureaucrats who might be lazy, or however they're portrayed in that sense. And what you really see of bright, dedicated people who are passionate about providing the services that government does. And so how, in your own capacity or more broadly, do you see getting young people to see government in a different way? How can you market the federal and all levels of government as really providing services we're all very much dependent on and make our lives better?
Thank you. It's a really interesting question. I would say that we have a line very long of young people that would love to come and work for us, but we don't have the jobs for them right now. And that ties back into constrained resources. To a certain extent, it ties back into a national challenge that we're facing of aging baby boomers that may not have prepared as much for retirement, so they're hanging out in their jobs, and there's not as many jobs for young people who are very well educated, very dedicated, want to put their skills to work. We'll also say, just to use an illustration of the U.S. Geological Survey, USGS, because they're, big operation right here in Menlo Park, and I was there a few months ago, and they were really frustrated because they have young postdocs or some cases grad students or otherwise working there who really would like to take on some of these jobs, but because our budget has been flat to down, the jobs haven't been available. So I don't think that in terms of making jobs available, that's the issue. I think encouraging folks to overlap, me working on a budget that will enable us to have more young people come and work, this creativity that we're trying to do around the Youth Initiative, which is working with the private sector to get young people working in youth conservation corps, where a stipend's being paid so that they will do field work over the course of a summer, and it could be broadly applied, but think of it mostly in, let's say, fixing up a national park or public lands at some level, or doing scientific work, conservation corps work alongside scientists, that at the end of that period, they're going to be better trained and more able to compete for the jobs, whether they're with the federal government or to get into grad school or someplace else. So, the budget doesn't really accommodate it. And, there's two big differences from being in the public sector and being in the private sector. One big difference is I'm now in what I'd call the forever business, and I'm doing it lurching from budget to budget if I'm lucky. Last year, sequestration was really, really devastating because it was an across-the-board cut, and the programs that got cut the worst were the young people, the internships and seasonal rangers and research assistants, and all that stuff got whacked because you could cut that. So the budgets don't align with the expectations, so that's one, very different. And the second is around risk. In the private sector, you're rewarded, your business in particular, you're rewarded for taking risk. And you're going to have some screw-ups, and that's good because that's how you really invent things and move forward. In the federal government, you step out, you take a risk, it doesn't work, you got a congressional inquiry that's saying, why did you do that stupid thing? I'll be getting, I'm sure, congressional inquiries about why did you go and try and impound those cattle? So you put yourself in a situation where people had guns pointing at you. That's kind of the way it works, which makes it more difficult. But bottom line is, I think we have to get creative. The public sector, the private sector, the business sector in making places for these young people that are really willing and able to sign up, but there aren't enough positions. And I do worry, and as it being out at the GS, one of the things they said that, the USGS used to be really kind of the place you would aspire to work, particularly if you're in the earth sciences and so on. And because of what we have not been able to do in terms of providing budgets and places for people to go, it's losing that luster a bit. And they're really, really worried about that. Because if all of us want to be warned about earthquakes, if we want to understand volcanoes, if we want to understand what's happening with drought and hydrology and ecosystems and interpreting the satellite data, we need these young people to come in. So it's a conundrum. One of the earlier questions about what can business do, I think supporting the work that we all rely on from the federal government and we expect, and letting our Congress members know that's important to us is really helpful. We could do a better job of marketing as well, and making sure that our elected officials know how important this work is so that they will fund the next generation. But it's the part that worries me the most, frankly, right now. And we have gotten some increase in the president's budget request for 2015 as it relates to programs to employ young people, but it's not enough. Sir.
Thanks, Secretary Jewell. I wonder if I could ask about your philosophy for managing the interface between renewables and environmental impacts of the renewables, issues like endangered species with photovoltaics or bird kills with windmills, run the river with dams. How do you think about setting the stage to get the right answers where they're confidence?
Did everybody hear that question? Okay. Thanks for speaking loud enough. I don't have to try and repeat it. It's a huge issue. Nothing's free. We have an impact no matter what we do. And bringing good science to bear so we understand that impact is really critical. So we'll be meeting with a person from the USGS tomorrow. USGS has done a lot of work with the Fish and Wildlife Service and the BLM and the utilities on, as birds fly over, we think that maybe the photovoltaic panels are being mistaken for water. And so that may be one consequence. We do know that you do have bird strikes with wind energy. We're trying to figure out whether there is actually an attraction that wind energy provides that draws more birds and bats to them. And again, USGS is working on that, so we have good science to go by. The wind energy industry is working on creative solutions that actually will identify when birds are coming through and shut down the turbines. The thermal solar, which is the Ivanpah Solar Project, which just got stood up in Nevada, in part due to funding from the Department of Energy, has birds that are flying into the thermal zone and dying. These are all things that we've got to research, we've got to learn from. And I am a believer that when you bring good science to the table, you will come up with solutions. But nothing is for free. And what's really important is that we're transparent, we're open, we work with industry, and we try and find a path forward that first avoids conflicts altogether, second minimizes conflicts if there are conflicts, and if you can't do either of those things, you mitigate the conflicts. And one of the first secretarial order that I've done in this job is around landscape level mitigation and understanding, where are the flyways for birds versus where is the wind energy potential. How do you separate the two? We've done this offshore wind in the East Coast so that you minimize the risk, and if there is take of species, for example, that is mitigated by, in some cases, financial mitigation that goes into supporting conservation objectives where they are most critical, where the habitat's that critical on the ground. So it's pulling up from a project by project basis to look at landscapes, and I think that's one path forward, but nothing is free. And I think we're about out of time. All right, I've got the time stamp. So thank you very much. Appreciate it.